Okay, so first of all, I want to thank CRELLA for inviting me to this symposium. My paper today is called Revisiting Rating Scale Development, Modeling Construct Choices Made by Scale Developers. And my co-authors are Bart Deges and Apichat Kambun-Ruang. As you can see in the images here, rating scales can take many different forms, but whatever format they take, they're seen as a key in the assessment process of productive performances because they represent the test construct to raters. However, in this paper, we would like to argue that the way rating scales are developed in our field is often not considered sufficiently, nor are they often a true representation of the stated test construct. So in the talk today, I will start by briefly reviewing how rating scale development is represented in the literature. I will then present the findings of a review of a corpus of scale development studies to show how published studies represent the scale construct. I will then present a model of sources of scale construct that we have developed based on our review of this corpus of studies. And I will take some time to show how the model can be used for both scale development and validation purposes. Test development is described in much detail in our professional standards documents, such as the ERA APA NCME standards published in 2014 and its previous iterations, and also the ILTA guidelines for practice published in 2007. Scale development, on the other hand, and how this relates to the larger stated and operationalized test construct is often absent from these documents. And there's little to no information provided about the possible sources that may influence the construct and rating scales, which are usually described as representing the wider test construct. There have been a number of authors who've described scale design in the language testing literature, most notably Fulcher 2003 and subsequent publications, and also a similar distinction is made in the CFR. So Fulcher divided approaches to scale design into two major approaches. First of all, intuitive methods where rating scale developers draw on existing rating scale, their own intuitions to develop rating scales. On the other hand, Fulcher described empirical methods where the rating scale developers would carefully look over performance samples that have been provided by test takers to develop the rating scale. This dichotomous approach to describing scale design was further held up by Fulcher et al. In 2011. Now, in that publication, they divided the scale design methods into what they call measurement-driven and performance data-driven. And this description has actually, I think, confused quite a few readers. So the measurement-driven approach is what the authors describe as one that prioritizes the ordering of descriptors on a single scale, and meaning is derived from the scaling methodology and the agreement of judges as to the place of the descriptors on the scale. On the other hand, they describe performance data-driven approaches where the primary value is on the observations of language performances. Now, Fulcher's conceptualization of rating scale development has really profoundly influenced research in language testing. However, more recently, others have noted, however, that this dichotomous conceptualization does not really always reflect reality, and that test developers draw on a range of sources when developing scales. So the aim of this study today is to gain a clearer understanding of the real-world rating scale development practices in published studies on rating scale development or revision. The guiding research question was which sources typically impact rating scale design in published research. So as to the methodology, we conducted a systematic review of empirical peer-reviewed publications on scale development or scale revisions. We did a database search and also a systematic search of key language testing journals, and we ended up with 36 peer-reviewed journal articles that we included in the corpus. We then developed a coding scheme in which we coded all the sources of scale development in each of the papers. And these are the sources of scale construct that we identified in the paper. So before I describe them each a little bit more, we had high intercoder reliability when we coded these, 95.4%. The sources we identified, first of all, there was what we quoted as theory or literature review, where scale developers drew on a review of the literature or a theory of language proficiency or development to inform the scale construct. So examples might include theories or models of language development, models of communicative competence, functional adequacy, comprehensibility, and so on. Target language use domain is where scale developers drew on information about the target language use domain by either involving domain experts, analyzing target language use discourse, or reviewing literature about the target language use domain to inform the scale construct. Others again drew on standards frameworks such as the CFR or curricula, syllabi, and even others engaged experts to gain expert intuition. Or they've looked at existing rating scales to inform their scales. A number of studies drew on performance samples of test takers, or they looked at what raters did, for example, what their background was, what feedback they provide about a scale that they're trialing out, or how well raters could use a rating scale, so by analyzing their rating performance. Studies also formed the scale construct based on the tasks for the test, and the score reporting or score use context also at times informed the scale construct. So let me give you some results of what we found in these 36 studies that we've reviewed. We divided the sources of scale construct into test external, so those that have nothing to do with the actual test that the scale is developed for, test internal sources of scale construct, and then a category of other. So you can see that out of the 36 studies that we reviewed, 35 drew on performance samples in some way or another, and 34 also used some information that they gained from the raters in the test. In terms of the test external sources, existing scales and theory and literature review and expert intuition were also quite commonly used. The least used sources of scale construct were curriculum and the target language use domain, and then also score reporting or score use context. We also looked at how many different sources each study drew on, and you can see here in the table that this varied widely. We had one study in the corpus that drew on 7 different sources of scale construct from our list, and there were on the other end of the continuum 4 studies that only drew on 2 sources. And you can see that many studies drew on the majority on either 3 or 5 sources of scale construct. So does this dichotomous categorization in the literature hold? Well, purely performance-based studies were not found. They were always paired with other sources, and purely intuitive approach was also not identified. So we can say that this dichotomous categorization probably doesn't hold in actual practice. But we also found no clear trends in what sources of scale construct typically appear together. This varied. So based on this coding of the 36 studies in our corpus, we came up with this model of sources of scale construct, which is really just a neater representation of the test external sources on the left, the test internal sources on the top right, and then also the score reporting or score use context. And all these influence the rating scale construct and how the rating scale is designed in some way or another. Since all testing occurs in a policy space that shapes the conditions for testing to take place, all sources which impact rating scale design are directly or indirectly influenced by the policy context in which they operate, and we therefore added this to our model. Logically, this policy context thus also shapes the assessment context, the way the assessment is developed, and the way in which scores are reported and used. By definition, policy is constantly in flux, and as such, the policy context is represented with a dotted line in this figure. So our model, of course, may not be complete. There may be other design choices that exist that were not represented in the corpus of studies that we coded. And of course, our model may also be skewed by publication bias, because we know that many scale development studies don't end up in peer-reviewed publications. But despite this, we feel that this model may be helpful for rating scale developers and testing specialists. So in the rest of the paper, I now want to show how this model can be used in practice. We think that this model could be very helpful for both scale development activities and scale validation. Let me start with scale development first. The guidelines for best practice in testing, such as the standards or the ILTA guidelines for practice, state that test development needs to start by determining the test purpose and score use. And while the standards also mention that regardless of the type of scoring procedure, designing the items and developing the scoring rubrics and procedures is an integrated process, and on the surface, it seems obvious that the test specifications, test items, and the scoring criteria are all developed with the same considerations in mind. It's in fact very often the case that the construct considerations of the wider test are not deliberated when the scoring criteria are developed. So how does this model we presented earlier fit into the wider test development process then? Well, all standards documents argue that test development needs to start by considering the test purpose and score use represented by the top two black boxes in our figure here. We would like to argue that the development of the scale needs to always start from that same starting point as well. But when developing a scale, we also need to consider three other aspects: score generalizability, precision of post-test predictions, and score reliability, which are the three black boxes on the bottom of this figure. And only once all these 5 aspects in the black boxes are considered should scale development proceed. The light gray box in the middle represents the content of the model we presented earlier based on our systematic review. So let's look at the 3 black boxes at the bottom in a little bit more detail. First of all, let me define these. Score generalizability relates to the degree to which a score can be generalized to new situations not expressly covered by the test construct. Precisions of post-test predictions mean how precisely the test can predict how well a test taker can cope in post-test communicative situations for which the test scores are being used as predictors. And finally, scoring reliability means how consistently raters can score performances. So how do these 3 considerations relate to the sources of scale construct I discussed in this paper? Well, let's look at some examples. In this table, you can see those 3 black boxes at the bottom of our figure as columns: generalizability, predictive precision, and reliability. And here are 2 example sources from our model of scale constructs, sources of scale construct. First of all, if we're choosing the target language use domain as a source of scale construct, then score generalizability is likely reduced, and the predictive precision is likely increased. The effect on score reliability is not entirely clear, and probably depends a bit on the test, the way the test is designed, and on the raters being used. Similarly, if we're basing our scale on a curriculum, a specific curriculum, then score generalizability may also be reduced depending on what is in this curriculum. And the predictive precision may likely increase depending on how tightly that curriculum is written. Let's look at some other examples in the next slide. If we're using a standards framework, and these standards frameworks are usually very general in nature, then score generalizability is likely increased because we're not focusing on a specific context. And the predictive precision is likely reduced as well because we're not focusing on a specific context. And the same can be said for the use of a theory from a literature review. When other scales are used as the source of test construct, then the effects on score generalizability, predictive precision, and rater reliability are quite unclear because it's unlikely that we know exactly what this other scale represents. So if we're zooming out a little bit more, then we can see how the overall test considerations, which are in the black box at the top, relate to task development and scale development, that these should influence both task development and scale development, and that scale development should look very carefully, especially at the three boxes at the bottom: generalizability, post-test predictions, and scoring reliability before proceeding. Let's see how the model could be used in validation activities. On the surface, it seems obvious that the test specifications, test items, and scoring criteria are all developed with the same considerations in mind. And it's in fact very often the case that the construct considerations of the wider test are not deliberated when the scoring criteria are developed. There are many examples of this in the literature and practice. For example, rating scales for specific purpose tests are often entirely linguistic in nature, without taking into account the assessment criteria valued by domain insiders or the specific communicative demands of the target language use domain. The ICAO rating scale, which is developed to guide the assessment of pilots and air traffic controllers working in international airspace, is one such example. Similarly, classroom assessment scales are often developed without considering local curricula or syllabi or the learning objectives. There were several examples also from our corpus where there was no congruence between the stated test construct and the way the rating scale was developed. For example, we found studies that developed rating scales for assessing PhD students' writing that were developed based on previous scale descriptors that were not developed for an academic context at all. And I could pull out numerous other examples. So to guide our validation activities, we need to start by examining that stated test construct and examine how well the scale aligns with this in terms of the sources of scale construct that were chosen. If the test developer notes that the test is designed to assess it, for example, academic writing ability, then the sources of scale construct should align very closely with that. So to finish off, every construct choice scale developers make has different implications for score generalizability, precision of post-test predictions, and score reliability. Developers should carefully think about the construct choices and how these relate to test purpose and score use. So the two top black boxes in the figure I presented earlier. And when we think about that, does it make sense to draw on 7 different sources when we're developing a rating scale? What are the impact of each of these sources on score generalizability, precision of post-test predictions, and score reliability? And might these interfere with each other in terms of their effect and maybe negating the effect of one or the other? And if we use so many different sources of scale construct, might we risk validity chaos, as Fulcher and Davidson wrote in 2009? And that's the end of my talk today. Thank you very much.